to you guys, and if you haven't been here before, I want to tell you a little bit about, just a little bit, and then we'll get into it, Futurecast. This is going to be an interactive platform in the room and out of the room. So Andrew Keene, our always moderator, is going to tee up a discussion with our special guest tonight, Ina, from Axios. She is the Chief Technology Correspondent, and I can't wait to sit down and hear what she's going to say tonight. So he's going to tee up a conversation with Ina for about 15 or 20 minutes, get some good things queued up, and then all of you very opinionated, smart people in the audience are hopefully going to get involved, and then we're going to go back and forth, and we're going to have a fun night. It's interactive outside of the room as well, and I know you're schooled and social, so all the good stuff is right behind me. Please share your thoughts. Also say hi. We have 4 cameras broadcasting Facebook Live tonight, so you guys can all check this out afterwards. So I think that is everything for me. Andrew, you can lead us into the night. Thanks.
Good. Well, thank you, Dwight, and thank you all for being here. We've got a really great crowd, and thank you, Ina, for putting yourself in the chair. We do 6 Futurecasts a year, and the last one is always a sort of a festive summary of what has happened both in the previous year and in the following year. So since we're in December 2017, I think what we want to do today is and Ina is as well positioned as anyone, given her role as the Chief Technology Correspondent of Axios and a long-time observer of tech and business in the Valley. Ina is as well positioned as anyone to evaluate what's going on broadly, both in business, cultural, and social terms. So Ina, let's begin in 2017. It's quite a year. Some people would say it's been a bad year for Silicon Valley. Some people would say it's been an amazing year. How would you summarize it? What's happened this year?
Well, I think it's certainly been a challenging year for the tech industry. I think a lot of the biggest developments weren't the technology being developed here, but the social implications of it. I think in the long run, it may be looked at as a really good year, a year that Silicon Valley addressed some issues that had kind of been brewing for a while, but that weren't either front of mind or hadn't really gotten the attention they needed. So I think in the moment, it's certainly been challenging and painful, whether you're talking about some of the challenges around sexual harassment or a lot of the developments around the implications of the manipulation of social media. I mean, these are really big societal topics that really dominated not just the headlines, but I think a lot of the energy around where tech companies spent their time. But again, I think it was probably necessary. I think one of the things that people always forget is how bumpy progress is, and that things tend to happen in moments, and I think this was the moment for both those things.
So you think when tech historians look back at 2017, what they'll see more than anything else are the social and cultural implications of the tech business, as opposed to new technologies like AI or virtual reality or augmented reality?
I think so. I mean, I think hopefully it won't be a flash in the pan, and it'll be the beginning of attention to these issues, because I think they're all serious and important. I think there were certainly plenty of technology developments. I think this was a year where we saw augmented reality sort of move out of the labs a little bit. We'll talk about it. I think it's going to happen a lot more next year and the year after that, but I think some of the foundational pieces came into play this year. I think conversational technology, things like the Google Assistant, Amazon's Alexa, Apple's Siri, I think a lot of important things happened, again, I think paving the way for the future. So I don't think progress slowed this year by any means, but I think if you look back at it, I think especially with a little distance, I don't think we'll think of 2017 as the year of the iPhone 10 as much as we will, the year sexual harassment got attention.
So talk about this issue of sexual harassment, because of course, it's not just in Silicon Valley. The woman, the woman from Uber,
Susan Fowler.
Susan Fowler was just named FT Person of the Year. So clearly it started in Silicon Valley, but it obviously has spread to politics and entertainment and business in general. Why do you think the issue of sexual harassment is so salient, or will be seen as so salient in the tech business for 2017?
Well, I mean, I think if you ask most women, it's been an issue for a long time. They just haven't had any redress. And I don't think sexual harassment by any means started in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is much too young for it to have started here. I think what did happen is the consequences started here. And again, they didn't start broadly. They started in a few places. I think it first came to light, with Uber around a bunch of actions that were seen as unpalatable for a variety of reasons, not just sexual harassment. I think, really the moment where the attention became more permanent was certainly around Harvey Weinstein and not in tech. But before that, it had also spread to some attention and consequences around the venture capital industry. And I think one of the reasons it happened there is you have a small number of individuals. I think one of the things that we're going to see in the next year or so as a society, and not really just tech, is how do you deal with the consequences when you realize how widespread this is? I think we're seeing that in Congress right now, where, yeah, it's great, one side or the other wants to see consequences for X person or Y person, but what happens when you find out this has been pretty widespread? And I think that's why we haven't seen as much attention at some of the biggest tech firms, and I think we will, because again, sexual harassment is a pervasive issue. I think the only thing that's new is there started to be consequences for it, which again, I hope, one, that there's consequence. I think what most people hope too is that there's a permanent and lasting change in behavior, certainly in what's acceptable, and I think that has yet to be proven.
What about the standing back a little bit and thinking about the reputation of Silicon Valley more broadly in 2017? Would it be fair to say that this was the year that people began to think more critically, particularly of the larger companies here?
Definitely. I think especially around the influence we saw around the election, I think that's where the conversation started, this idea that social media was vulnerable to outside influence. I think we saw two big things around that. One, the influence of social media, and then this other conversation that was adjacent around the fakeness or legitimacy of news, and a lot of question of who controls the media. And for people at the intersection of media and tech, both conversations were happening simultaneously. For the tech industry specifically, I think it was the year that the kid gloves sort of came off, and people said, after years of really leaving Silicon Valley alone, through a lot of pressure, I think the tech industry said, look, you don't understand us, we can manage ourselves. And I think that argument held sway for a long time, and I think this was the year, because of some of the stuff we saw around the election, that I think a lot of regulators in the US said, actually, we have a job to do and we're going to start doing it. And I think there was also more attention to some of the downsides of technology.
Yeah, I mean, it seems as if Steve Bannon and Elizabeth Warren, they don't agree about very much, but they seem to agree about the dangers of some of the large tech companies in Silicon Valley.
There was, definitely an interesting congregation of folks that certainly were the most critical. I think, certainly when the hearings happened more recently in Congress, you saw some of the Bay Area more liberal members among some of the sharpest critics, and with the biggest concerns. And you did see the biggest concerns from the further right and the further left over technology for different reasons, but definitely you did see that's where the strongest concerns were coming from. I think we'll see more broadly. I think we will see a large number of people, because tech is only growing in its importance. It's not because tech is inherently bad or inherently good. It's because of how important the industry is to the future of the country, not just the future of itself.
What do you think is, I accept your point about the social and cultural implications of technology in 2017, but when we look back, what do you think will be the biggest technological story of 2017? Bitcoin, blockchain, AI?
Well, I think we'll certainly have something to say about Bitcoin. It hasn't been written. It may be another flash in the pan. It may be, we've had
but
a
if you
long
don't know,
history.
it may be or it may not be. Can you tell? If you don't know, who does?
I think a lot of people are rightly pointing to, in the history of investable things generally don't start from little and go up and up and up. That's generally not the way things happen. That's honestly the most insight I really have is, look at what has happened in the past in things that people put their money in. I don't think it's a technology story. I think
it's a tulip story?
It may be. I look at tulips, I look at
.com.
.com for me is the one I lived through. There's signs when people who don't know anything about it put money in, when people who don't generally invest. I read about, I'm sure many other people did, people taking out mortgages to buy Bitcoin. That doesn't seem like a sign of a healthy market to me.
So you wouldn't buy Bitcoin?
Well, I'm a journalist, so I tend not to have much money to invest, so that's good. And I also tend to be a terrible investor. Now I don't because for many years I just haven't invested in individual things, either because of company policy or whatever. But when I did, I was terrible at it. So.
Well, let me rephrase the question. We had David Hornick actually here last year, and he argued that the Internet of Things was an invention. He didn't even know what it meant. And a lot of people say the same about AI. It seems to be a term that's used to describe everything from bottled water to new startups. Has 2017 been a year where the Internet of Things or AI becomes more real, more concrete in your mind and in the minds of startup people and investors?
For AI, definitely. I think for IoT, it was a tweener year. So I think the Internet of...
You mean between?
I'll explain, yeah. So I think the Internet of Things has become very real for things that we don't see, so industrial things. I think that's where a ton of value is. It's really transforming the way companies do business. So, a good example is it used to be that shipping containers were on boats around the world, and you had to use satellite photos to figure out where the heck they are. Now that it's definitely cost effective to have satellite and cellular connectivity on every one of those things. That stuff is all happening because it makes obvious business sense. What hasn't happened and will take time is a ton of gadgets in the home connected to the internet. It's too difficult, the utility is too small, but it will make sense. There will come a time when it makes sense for those scenarios we've all heard about. The washing machine can sense that it's about to break down and somehow signals you. That will make sense. The cost of modules has to come down, but another thing, it just has to be way less complicated. You think about...
And are we waiting for a new technology? Some people say that, and I know this is partly hosted by Ericsson, some people say that the IoT won't become real until 5G becomes ubiquitous.
I think that might be right in terms of timing. I don't think 5G is the only reason. Again, I think 5G will have something to say about how much it costs to add cellular connections. We've got 18 different standards. That's not sustainable. We need more utility. And I think some of that we saw with voice assistants. I think you will see, for better and worse, certain companies grow in power. I think, Google is one of those that always comes to the forefront. And I think you'll see somebody tie all these things together in a way that consumers gravitate to.
I'm intrigued that you argue that sexual harassment is the key story of 2017 and not the impact of technology on jobs, which is also a story that's brewing, and the impact of AI particularly on jobs. Is that because you think that's less convincing, more amorphous?
It just hasn't been written yet. I think that's the good thing is that story is in its early stages. I think now is the right time to be paying attention and make sure that we're paying attention to the right things. I think a lot of attention, because we all grew up with the same sci-fi movies, is when are computers going to take over the world? When is a literal robot coming for my literal job? And I don't think of that specific thing is the most present issue. It's an
2021 maybe?
It's an issue, but it's not the one that I wish more people were paying attention to. The ones that I think are super present because the decisions are being made now is we are starting to use algorithms, use machine learning to make decisions. But we aren't spending enough time, or not enough people are spending enough time. Some people, Cathy O'Neill's written a ton about this. She has a book, The Weapons of Math Destruction. We are using algorithms to decide who gets into what college, who gets a loan, who gets parole. What are the factors? I don't think any of us in this room probably know what factors are being used to decide those. Are they really the factors we want? Are they a reflection of our current society, of our ideal society? These are super important questions. I was at a Microsoft AI event today, and I was talking to Harry Shum, who's led research there and leads their AI efforts, and we were talking about a lot of things. And it's something that really people in AI, and I think Microsoft is one that takes it very seriously. You need to consider a whole range of things other than just, is it good at chess? Is it good at Go? And that's what gets the headlines, unfortunately.
Do you think, moving forward to 2018, do you think 2018 may be the year where we see a new generation of AI startups focusing on these issues, focusing on social justice and discrimination, and so many of the other issues that are challenging our society?
I think for sure. I think there are definitely groups. I think we'll see a lot of the issues-oriented stuff come from the folks that have been doing this work for a long time. So I think you'll see organizations like ACLU or GLAAD or, again, groups that have looked at discrimination issues recognize this is the issue of the time. You already are. The ACLU has been at the forefront. I know GLAAD has talked from an LGBT perspective, a lot of existing organizations. I think as far as startups, I think you will see a lot of companies start around what can AI do for X industry. I'm writing about one for tomorrow that I can't yet talk about, but I think you're going to see a lot of people go from general AI, algorithms, machine learning to how can we tackle a specific topic. I think the challenge is actually going to be finding the people that know enough about this area. I think AI could probably have a more dramatic impact sooner on more industries if there were more AI experts.
Do people know what AI is?
Not if a lot of non-AI companies have their way.
Well, how would you define it?
I think artificial intelligence to me is not the right term for a lot of what we term AI. It's algorithms, it's machine learning, it's a lot of things. It's not actually intelligent. It's just a way better computer than the last computer. But that doesn't sound very good. But that's less of a concern to me than the fact we just have a lot of what I've heard described as AI washing. Every company is a machine learning AI startup. And in fact, they're not. And that's nothing new. There was a mad rush. I remember, companies would see their stock go up 10% because they said they were opening a website, which didn't do anything for their business. Then they were an e-commerce company. Then they were a mobile-first company. So that's nothing new. I don't think AI is probably the right term for a lot of discrete things, but that's not very high on my list of concerns.
Interesting that you haven't even mentioned the internet yet. Is the internet passé? Is it just everything now?
I don't think the internet is everything, but I do think it's ubiquitous. I think what we are seeing that's really interesting is almost all the promises of .com 1.0 before the bubble are coming true, and that's fascinating. That did happen in 2017.
What do you mean?
So almost every crazy startup that we looked at as a failed idea in what 1.0 has emerged as a successful business in 2.0. I'll give you some examples. Ordering pet food over the internet, now a legitimate thing. Ordering furniture over the internet, now a legitimate thing. Groceries, and you can go back to webvanpets.com. The world wasn't ready for it, and their business models might not have been right, but those things are actually all deliverable over the internet. And I think the other thing that didn't come true before the .com bubble burst, but is coming true, is that actually every industry is being transformed to the degree possible by the internet. So there were a lot of industries that actually escaped .com 1.0 without the incumbents really being shaken up. And I think today you'd be hard-pressed to point to many businesses that haven't fundamentally been changed. There's very few things that haven't really been changed.
What you say, to come true, what needs to happen to come true? Keith and I used to work for Keith. He had a startup that was the sister of Skype, and it was real-time video conferencing. And we thought it was brilliant. We were the only ones, of course, back in 2000, and when was it?
2003. But was the idea wrong or just the technology
but that's
there?
my question to you. Broadband still wasn't ubiquitous. To make this thing real, what has to happen? Is it a cultural thing? Is it really just, the 5Gs or the broadbands or the devices? What has to happen?
It depends what we're talking about. And it's why I think this year was actually the perfect right time for everything that we promised in 99 and 2000 to happen. So
Wow.
what was that, 17 years? I think, there's famous saying, Bill Gates loves it, lots of people, that, we overestimate in the short term and we underestimate in the long term. But I think, if we can dream it, it's probably going to happen. It just takes longer. That's certainly been true with our last generation of dreams. For our next generation of dreams, VR, AR, holograms, all that stuff, it'll probably happen too. It'll take longer. If you look at something like, we can imagine a perfect VR discussion where you and I happen to not be in the same place and we're having a
I
conversation.
thought this was VR.
It's actually pretty far before that will be a satisfying experience. You can do it today. You can have some sort of telepresence agent in a bunch of ways. So there's a little robot that runs around with a tablet as its face, and I could be sitting here. No one would want to come and watch that. The other thing you can have is a not very good avatar. That can happen. But to really have it be really good fidelity in a device that isn't totally isolating. So, strapping on a headset, I think this was the year that a lot of us decided VR wasn't ready for prime time. So a lot of startups had a lot of ideas around it, and consumers said, interesting, not saying no, but I'm saying not right now.
But you see stuff from the inside. What do VCs now believe are ready for prime time? Is it the blockchain stuff?
Again, there's a lot of people with really strong
the
strong
VCs
feelings.
you admire, the people who you really think get it, and not just sheep. I hope there are no VCs.
I think there is a lot of investment around VR and AR that makes sense, that's doable in a reasonable time frame, and that reasonable time frame may not be right this second. I think there are a lot of businesses around transforming further industries. Again, I think there are relatively few industries that haven't been touched and changed, but I think there are plenty of industries that still have a lot of room to change. So I think, I think really smart investors are looking at something that's still broken or still really fragmented.
You started with the issue of sexual harassment. Before we go to the audience, let's talk a little bit about how you see that narrative playing out in 2018. Is it going to stay in the headlines? Is it going to profoundly change tech?
I hope so. I hope
not
just in
but
tech. I really don't know.
How could it?
How could it, for the things that we've said are unacceptable for a small few leaders, to become truly unacceptable? And I think if you talk to most women in business, you will find out, or in any industry, you'll find out that the level of harassment they have endured in their career is fairly widespread. Some of it's subtle, some of it's not. It didn't always come from the CEO, it came from middle managers. I think what has to change is, it's sort of at that, if you're running for office or if you're the CEO, you can't have done it, but it hasn't become, we haven't had enough time for it to become just unacceptable in the workplace. And I think if Silicon Valley is to, and other industries are to really learn from it, it has to fundamentally change. But I think more broadly, it's a symptom of, an unequal still playing field for a lot of different groups, not just women, but also people of color, some of whom are women, LGBT people, some of whom are women. I think, it is not the diverse place we want it to be. I think Silicon Valley and tech is idealistic and likes to see itself in its best light, which is a very good quality when you're trying to build new things that are going to encounter obstacles. It's really important that you have this vision and stick to it. But I think to be an equitable world, we also have to look at the realities of where we are. And I think time will tell how long attention is. It's been longer than I thought. That's the positive thing. It didn't go away overnight, which I initially thought it might.
Kat Gordon, you've been nodding. Kat is an old friend of Futurecast. I think you've been to almost all of them, certainly the early ones. Kat, you were featured in a big New York Times story a couple of months ago, being one of the female activists, I think, in tech who are trying to change the world. You might very briefly introduce yourself, tell us what you're doing, and tell us whether you agree with Ina's prognosis on the centrality of sexual harassment in the Silicon Valley narrative this year and next year. Easy questions.
Thanks, Andrew. So my name is Kat Gordon. I'm a social change entrepreneur about the lack of women and people of color in creative leadership. My background is as a Don Draper in the advertising world. I completely agree with everything you've said. And what's interesting is that technology is actually the amplifier that was missing from this discussion. So if you think about the Me Too hashtag that brought this to critical mass, that's what made this something that ended up on Time Magazine's cover. I think the thing I'd like to add is the classification of this, meaning that sexual harassment is actually, it's interesting when it's Harvey Weinstein because we know who he is. But what about hotel maids and people that work in industries where we don't see? Where does tech play a role there to give those women a mechanism to report what's happening in their worlds? That's what I'm hopeful around.
Is that what tech should be, as a sort of an instrument of social justice?
Of course. Why not? I mean, I feel like everything I've accomplished in the last 6 years around raising awareness in my own industry has been facilitated through social media. And
how much, Kat, you know Silicon Valley very well, how much has this issue permeated the Valley, startups, investors, what people talk about and think about? Is it really on everybody's minds now?
I think so, and maybe there are different camps about, there are men that are afraid, and then there are women that are emboldened and kind of cautiously optimistic, but I don't think you can walk around Palo Alto and not be aware that this is a national conversation that, as you said, is happening here. This is the birthplace of the consequences happening here. I like the way you phrased it.
And I think Kat brings up a really interesting point and an important one around technology's role in the discussion. Has probably been overlooked. They've looked a lot at the fact that Silicon Valley is where a nexus of this conversation has been, but not really the technologies that played a role. And I totally agree, Twitter and the Me Too hashtag really helped get critical mass, but I think it's also important to point out blogging, the fact that Susan Fowler could tell her story on her own in a compelling way. Quite frankly, a lot of media would not have written that story. It was one person's story. It was hard to verify. There's a reasons why this discussion hasn't happened until now. And it's not totally that everyone was invested in sexual harassment continuing. Some of it was, by their nature, some of these things, whether it's sexual assault or sexual harassment, are difficult stories to tell. But when you have a platform and can tell it, you can tell it, somebody else can disagree. So I do think technology played a role in both the initial telling of that particular story and in the broad amplification of it.
Elisa Jagerson, you own a company focusing on branding and innovation, image in this business. Does Silicon Valley have a brand problem?
In this particular category, I hope we have a brand problem, I will say. I think there is a...
What do you mean you hope?
In this, I'll argue that we have made a great deal of progress in the awareness conversation. I don't think women are doing their enterprise value calculation on whether or not to come forward. I don't think that 99.9, the 9/9s of women are doing their MVP any differently than they were before. It's still incredibly costly. And so what I get very curious about is, while we may get some extra attention, perhaps negative, for being at the front of the consequences, what I get very interested about and excited about is, once we're on the other side of that math being done differently by women, by men, what becomes possible? What happens when all of that untapped asset base is released? And so I hope to be both the sort of the blemish and the great hope.
You agree with this unrealized potential?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think we talk a lot about why aren't there women in tech. Until this year, the conversation was all about how many people are going into STEM, and that was only a piece of it. We didn't look at this question of what's it like for the women who actually get here. Why don't people go into the career? Isn't just, I don't want to study math, I don't want to study engineering. It's, my older cousin went into tech and had a bad experience. And if we change that, we get more women, we get more ideas. And it's not just women, it's all the groups that aren't as well represented in the industry, I think you get more perspectives. We need it. We're facing huge problems as a society. We need everyone's ideas.
Is the solution regulation? Is it a political issue? Do we need more government intervention in these things?
I'm not sure that regulation in and of itself is the answer to sexual harassment. There may be aspects of the legal system. I think the biggest regulatory things have been around, should companies be able to have non-disclosure agreements that cover harassment settlements? That's a small regulatory piece. I think, the legalities around sexual harassment, it's still going to be a difficult thing to prosecute. Sexual assault is still going to be a difficult thing to prosecute because of the nature of it. When somebody steals a loaf of bread, there are different sorts of evidence around that than there might be, a conversation, a touch. But I think the difference is, in the past, it didn't matter. It didn't matter if everyone knew it. People still wouldn't come forward, and there wouldn't be consequences if they were, so people wouldn't come forward. I think, to Elisa's point, I think a lot of people still, evaluate that. What is it going to mean for my career, my family, my mental health, and still make the decision it's not worth it. And that changed a little this year. It didn't dramatically
None of the
change.
men in the audience are making eye contact with me, so I'll have to pick on somebody. Larry Downs. Larry's another old friend of Futurecast, best-selling author, spends much of his life in Washington, D.C., expert on the politics, the so-called politics of Washington, D.C., on regulation, very much involved in the debates around that in D.C. Larry, is this debate, how is it playing out in D.C.? Is this for real, or is this just another Silicon Valley fantasy?
Well, you're talking about the regulation of tech more broadly than just the employment issues.
Broadly, this issue of, as Kat said, using tech to make the world a better place.
Yeah, well, I'm all for that. What I'm not all for is the idea of Congress figuring out how tech should be used, how tech should be developed. There were hearings just this week, including one today, on AI. So imagine senators talking about how to regulate AI. They don't even know how to spell it. And then today, a hearing on antitrust and whether or not we should change the nature of antitrust to take into account how large internet platforms operate. Well, again, they don't know how large internet platforms operate. So, I've always believed that the best regulator of tech is the next generation of tech. That just pulls the rug out from everybody, including people who seem like they're unstoppable or unbeatable. We could make a long list of those within about 5 seconds without much trouble. Which isn't to say that there isn't a role for Congress, there isn't a role for the government, but for the last, 20 years we've had a Congress that effectively can't pass any legislation anyway, and this one so far has not disappointed in that regard. So there's certainly been lots more hearings this year about tech-related things, but no real legislation has come forward, and for the most part, that's probably a good thing.
Well, let's hear another point of view on this. Gary Reback, many of you will know him. He was the famous, and the still famous, Silicon Valley lawyer who really challenged Microsoft's monopoly in the 90s, and I think enabled the conditions for the sort of eruption of innovation in Web 2.0. Gary, where are we in 2017 in terms of the Googles and the Facebooks of the world and the enabling of innovation in Silicon Valley?
Well, I'm not sure I could answer that kind of question.
In a minute.
In a minute or two.
Or 30 seconds.
I think there's a lot
Briefly, anyway.
I think there's a lot of confusion on a number of these issues. One is that there's a difference between antitrust enforcement and regulation. And it's not just a semantic difference. In a regulatory situation, you take a group of people who come from wherever, political appointees, and you charge them with the responsibility of running an industry. You don't even tell them what they're supposed to do, what their goals are, but they're supposed to run the industry, and it becomes very intrusive. They start trying to figure out how much people should charge, who they ought to sell to, and stuff like that. Historically, that doesn't work very well. Antitrust enforcement is law enforcement. It involves the concept of the government passing laws which have already been passed and don't need updating that set the general rules about how entities compete. Once the government has done that, it steps back and lets the companies duke it out in free and open competition. We in antitrust think of ourselves as the free market alternative to regulation. We have become very confused about the two things. Back in the Microsoft day, there were these important hearings, and the chairman of Senate Judiciary Committee was Orrin Hatch, and he said, I remember it well, if we don't start enforcing the antitrust laws, we're going to end up with the Internet Regulatory Commission. Just exactly what the previous speaker said. So we really haven't had much antitrust regulation, or antitrust enforcement rather, during the Obama administration. It has fundamentally changed Silicon Valley. I mean, I've been here a very long time. I graduated from law school in 1974. I always thought my role was to protect the popcorn popper, which is what I think of Silicon Valley. People who work here don't think of themselves as working for a particular company. When they get up in the morning, they think of themselves as working for Silicon Valley, Inc. They go from company to company throughout their careers. In the popcorn popper, there are always new ideas emerging. They've got to get to market, though. The kernels have to pop. And very recently, we've come into a regime which to me looks like the U.S. steel industry, where we have 3 or 4 big companies and everybody works for them. In my view, that's not good, and it's certainly not Silicon Valley. So that's a short answer.
So I want to introduce Kieran Pryor, a friend of mine sitting in the front row. Kieran is a very interesting character, former superstar trader at Goldman Sachs, now a founding CEO of an AI company. Kieran, we haven't talked much about startups or tech. What's going on here? What's your view of AI? I mean, you obviously have an interesting new startup. You're putting your name and your resources around it. Where do you see AI playing a role in the future? Is it as central as some of us are suggesting?
For me, there's a clear dichotomy between the big 4 or 5, if you will, who are really betting on technology in its purest sense of the word, the advancement of ideas for ideas' sake. I think that is the Googles or the Amazons, even the Facebooks or some, and I think the money behind that, such as Masayoshi at SoftBank, who launched the Vision Fund this year, $100 billion is controlled by one person's interpretation of AI. That's, in my interpretation, it might be the only way that can happen, but it's seemingly dangerous to me. So when Ina spoke about startups coming from a product angle, that's exactly the way I think AI will evolve. And I think there's a lot of synergies or a lot of likenesses coming out of AI that feel like, to me, as if we're back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when search was becoming almost antiquated and Google came out of that pack at that point. But Google came out of that pack because they had an immensely useful product, which was very simple. And I don't believe that anyone else believed that they could have done that. And when they bought DoubleClick, they dominated that ad market very clearly. But they were able to do that because of the product that they had was so simple compared to everyone else. And they were very clear on what they had. So in my mind, I think the productization of AI and the morality question around AI is really important.
Fascinating. Ina, then, as Kieran has suggested, are we back in 1998, not with all the crazy .com ideas of pets.com and all those other companies that may be real now, but more that we think, for example, just as in 1998, we thought search was finished and that was closed down, but there is going to be a company like a Google who will come along and reinvent the whole field?
I think we may. I think there may be a company or many companies, or at least a few companies, that come to utilize AI, that come to understand its benefits well enough to create a whole new domain. I mean, if you look at Amazon, they came around and understood how the internet was going to change really how we bought and sold everything, and really became, I think they were, I always talk about how I think everyone for 20 years now has underestimated Amazon, and they've always been a couple steps ahead. We may see that with AI. I think the thing we need to be concerned about is what Gary mentions, the notion that AI is going to be this thing where large amounts of data are going to matter. Largely that data exists in the hands of a few small companies, and I think there is a risk that it will be hard to compete with those companies. There is an opportunity. I think people talk all the time about the democratization of AI as a service, and I think we will see plenty of companies born that take the universal knowledge that a Google or a Facebook has and apply it to a specific domain. I think that will happen even if the system isn't that great. I think the question is, can the next Google be born? Can the next Facebook be born? And to Gary's point, I think that's all that a lot of the people that view Silicon Valley economics want to see is the environment fertile enough, open enough for that to occur.
Every time I look at you, I see Facebook, and then I realize that sitting behind you is Eric Porterfield from Facebook, so it's not an optical illusion. Eric, are we being too harsh on guys like you?
I think I can't answer that. That's not what I work on. I do our social
good. You're
good.
in the tech for the good area, but should we be worried, maybe not about Facebook, but about these super large Silicon Valley companies, say, monopolizing data, as Gary suggested?
No, because I see on our platform every single day people coming to Facebook to connect one another to do something good. They get the help they need in a natural disaster. In India they can if they need blood they can get they can find a blood donor in a time of need. They can donate to a cause. We just announced a new mentorship and support where you can find mentors. So I see the good side of technology of people who are on the platform coming together to get the help they need.
So I'm gonna jump in and agree with Eric. I think he's the wrong person to ask, and I think we've learned that this year.
Well, he's the only person from Facebook here.
I agree. No, well, and I think Facebook is the wrong company to ask.
Who should we be asking?
Well, I think we as a society have to ask more questions. I think that's what 2017 taught us. I think Eric's well-intentioned. I think lots of people at Facebook are building a product they think will make the world a better place. I think we as a society have to say, are we comfortable with the risks that they're willing to take? And I think what we saw in 2016 was that there's a million good uses of Facebook. There continue to be a million good uses of Facebook. And it is the case that Facebook has reached a level of pervasiveness that what happens on its platform can change things far beyond its platform. And that's where I think the discussion shifts from even an antitrust one to a what are we as a society comfortable with? What limits do we feel like we need to have? And to the degree that Facebook or any of these large platforms can change the way we think about our leadership and stuff, I think there are hard questions that need to be asked. And I also think that Facebook is part of the solution because they understand their platform, and I think the people that want to make it a tool for good have good ideas also on what can be part of the solution. So some of the things that Facebook has done in the last few months around what would it look like if certain articles were flagged for their verifiability, for their credibility. And I think one of the things that I was most impressed about in Facebook's recent response is Facebook acknowledging they're not the ones that should be doing that. That we don't really want the tech companies, the platforms deciding what truth is either. And so Facebook is partnering with Pointer, with Snopes, with people that are experts in what actually is factually true to say, hey, this is true. I think where Facebook comes in is they're tremendously good at writing algorithms. We need to harness some of that power to make sure that not only is it good for ad monetization, not only is it good for making sure that I'm connecting to my friends, is it surfacing good content? And I think Facebook's algorithms, Google's algorithms could do a better job to stop picking on Facebook for a second and pick on Google It is still the case after, these recent, whether it's a mass shooting or something else, Google News will surface a bunch of crap that has the right code words in there, but says, ISIS is to blame or this is to blame when we don't actually know that. I think Google's algorithms around news can get a lot better. So I think we as a society have to set some new expectations, but it's also unrealistic, certainly to think that, a few Congress people that may or may not understand the internet are going to solve it. We actually do need the companies that build these tools to do it, and I think they mostly want to. I think most of the people go to work at Facebook like Eric, wanting to make the world a better place.
Albert Kim, you're heading up one of the venture groups at Ericsson. Does this conversation resonate with you? You probably are making more hardcore technological investments, but are you seeing the blurring of the world of sort of hard technology and of society and politics?
To be honest, on a day-to-day basis, we see very little of that, and maybe that's a bad reflection on the venture industry. In corporate venture capital, where we are active at Ericsson Ventures, we have another layer of difficulty, right? So we're trying to generate financial returns, competing with all the financial investors, while adding strategic value back to the corporate business. So that is kind of a lot of internal business development that you have to overlay of the typical diligence that another financial investor would do. So I think where it has, I take that back, so what has affected this year, how we look at deals is, we looked at a company that shall rename unnamed, where one of the venture investors that shall also rename unnamed was accused of sexual harassment, then fired by the venture capital company. So you as a new investor in the company then actually think about that, right? Is that, and unfortunately you think about that in fairly economic terms, right? Is that bad for the company's outcome? And
what about more hardcore technological issues? When are you going to give us 5G?
Well,
and how's that going to change everything?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? So we look at it both from we call it 5G supply and 5G demand angle, right? And the supply angle is really technologies that would help our solution get better. So this is hardcore radio technologies. How do you squeeze one more bit out of per hertz of bandwidth? It's SDN NFV technologies that help orchestrate various flavors of access. And I think that is a quantitative scientific problem. And I think we're well on our way to delivering multi-gigabits per second to a handset in not so long a time. The demand question, I think, is a harder question, right? So we dub it 5G demand. And so what are the use cases that will actually use 5 gigabits per second to every one of our handsets? I would say history is in our favor, right? Whenever there was some quantum leap in wireline connectivity, storage availability, people have found a way to use it, and in fact, well exceeded, right? There is another famous Bill Gates quote when there was, I think, 1 megabyte of storage in DOS. No one will ever use it. And I remember my days when you had to configure around it. You could actually get more RAM, right? So we spend a lot of time thinking about that at Ericsson Ventures. We invest in ecosystems that are still quite early stage, but at scale have the promise of driving very high bandwidth, very, very low latency connectivity demand. And those are some of the more buzzy things that we have talked about a lot
Bill
today.
Brown at Matterport, I know you're one of Ericsson's investments. What are you doing that are changing everything? I know you're in the would you call it the 3D industry or
we
VR?
call it the immersive media industry. There's multiple different types of consumption.
And Bill's company was demoing here earlier in the drinks.
Yeah. So first of all, I want to thank you guys for this conversation. This is just an incredible,
Ina, not me.
Yeah, an incredible range of topics. There's so much to connect with. So, and one of the things I think that's interesting from Matterport's standpoint. So I worked at one of the first virtual tour companies in 98, 99. And we were one of those companies that had so many barriers in terms of the infrastructure that it wasn't in place. We had browser plugins. We had limited bandwidth. We didn't have the great 3D sensors that we have today. We didn't have Amazon cloud services. There are so many things that are in place. And so you move forward, and yeah, we're one of the kind of things people said were going to happen that's now happening. We're kind of using the technology available today. We can do very quick digital reconstructions of spaces, let people walk through them remotely. But then the next kind of wave of things, you start to look at AI and how that affects our business. We've captured over 700,000 spaces. We have over 700 million images with depth and color. So all of a sudden, you move from an industry or a business that was driven by computer vision technology. 3 years ago, that computer vision technology was driven by people developing algorithms, kind of very smart people developing complex algorithms, to the whole field really moving to AI and development of convolutional neural networks based on deep learning training data sets. And it's kind of crazy that in that short amount of time, all of a sudden the capabilities that we've been able to bring to the table very quickly has accelerated past what we thought. We hadn't.
So you agree with Kieran, really, in this sort of the moment that this could be, a year or two. It's hard to define a year, but these few years are when something completely new will come along and make something obvious, which wasn't self-evident before.
I think it isn't something. It is going to be multiple somethings, and it's going to be there. I mean, there's probably 1,000 companies like Matterport out there with a kind of particular use case, particular business that they're going after, that they're now able to apply AI to. And I think in our case, we had a general concept when we started the company 6 years ago. Hey, if we just create more data, we get better at creating data. We will then be able to create more data, get better at creating data. We didn't really understand this concept until pretty recently, just kind of how true that was going to be and how big an impact that was
Nice
going
to have such a humble CEO, the entrepreneur who acknowledges there are 1,000 other people like him. Most entrepreneurs, at least when I was an entrepreneur, we all claimed that we were the first people to ever think of whatever we were doing, and of course everybody else was doing the same thing.
Well, I think Bill is exactly right. I think when the foundational technologies advance that much, it does create a million different ideas, because you're using VR and depth capture to do one particular thing, and then AI on top of it. But there are so many of these things. And I do think it's also an exciting time in that people are looking at bigger problems. There was a period of time a couple of years ago where I think you could legitimately say, my old boss, Kara Swisher, called it assisted living for millennials, where a lot of the money in tech was going into how do we take something that people used to do for themselves and make it an on-demand service. So there was, not just Blue Apron, but a million people, the only thing missing was someone to chew your food for you. So any entrepreneurs out there...
Good joke. I'm sure that someone's thought of that.
But that said, I bet we will come back and there will be a time where it won't look like all these startups did, where there was a person going to park your car for you. Those startups pivoted, because that turned out not to be a great math equation, but
pivoted means they failed, really,
or did something different, whatever. But that idea failed. The idea that an on-demand service was needed to pay somebody to go park your car in San Francisco, the economics weren't quite there. But certainly, you won't have to park your car. That idea is right. The idea that
I didn't think we were all going to have cars in the future.
Well, I think that part of
the car
more
will
of the
park
truth
itself,
is that
right?
The car will park itself, and you won't own the car. But I think
the car will park us. I think
a lot of these other on-demand services will happen. There will be less humans and expense in it, so it will happen differently. I do think a lot of that will happen, but I think those weren't big ideas for the moment. Transforming eating is a big idea. Delivering a meal that somebody else cooked is an old idea.
Faraz, I'm not going to do your last name very well. Hood boy, I didn't say rude boy, right? You're sort of in some ways equivalent of Albert at AT&T. You see a lot of early stuff, innovation. What about this idea that we now have these, as Ina said, these foundational technologies that are enabling, again, as Kieran had suggested, the profound changing of the world? Do you think 2017, 2018, 2019, people can look back and think, wow, this is when these new technologies, whether it's AI or the Internet of Things, became real?
No. I think what will happen and is happening is a recognition that the horizontal technologies. I mean, 2 years ago we were talking about big data. We don't talk about that anymore. It's not that the data disappeared. The data is still very much there. What I think we are finally starting to move towards is a recognition that the selection of problem that you go out and solve is more important than how you solve it. And I think that has been the hallmark of the most successful startups, that they go out and find the business problem that is worth solving, and they use technology to solve that problem rather than focus on buzzwords of AI, edge clouds, 5G, whatever it may be. At some level, we don't care. What we really care about is solving the real problems. And that, I think, is becoming something that we are getting better as a society, where we're starting to let go of the buzzword and starting to focus a little more on what is the nature of the problem and is it worth solving, and then let's talk about how to resolve it.
So Steve Case wrote an interesting book a couple of years ago called The Third Wave, in which he talked about the rise of the rise not of the West, but of the rest. And Silicon Valley's increasingly, if not marginal, but less central role in the world of tech. We're in Silicon Valley, most of us live here, most of us think very insularly. But some of us have escaped. My old friend Keith Tier, who is another old friend of Futurecast, he now spends, three weeks of the month in England. He's doing investment and innovation with a UK venture fund. Keith, how does Silicon Valley look from the outside? You probably know it as both in and out as well as anyone.
Well, firstly, I'm a big believer in Silicon Valley. I've lived here since 1996, after starting Europe's first ISP in '94. And I escaped Europe on purpose to come to a better place. So let's start by saying that. I do think that the big narratives of 2017, I think there's two, and they both impact Silicon Valley massively. One is an optimistic narrative, the other is a pessimistic narrative. The pessimistic narrative Gary referred to a little bit. By the way, I think venture capital is more to blame than Google, Facebook, and the rest, because venture capital doesn't fund long-term big ideas very well anymore. It's all about traction, and there's now a new class of investment called pre-seed. It's drip-feeding small amounts of money, being scared of risk, not wanting to lose your money. That's a post-bubble phenomenon that's now massive, and very, very few venture capitalists any longer take risk unless the numbers support their case. And that's bad. And that leads to Google and Facebook gobbling up the kernels that haven't yet popped, not only Google and Facebook's appetite. So I think you've really got to put some blame at the door of venture capital, and that is Silicon Valley. It is no longer a place that takes risk on Sand Hill Road. You've now got 350 microfunds in the valley, people like Mike Maples.
So where's the risk happening? Outside?
The risk is in the hands of smaller funds. Arrington, my co-founder at TechCrunch, is one. He just launched a crypto fund last week, 100 million. Mike Maples at Floodgate, Jeff Clavier at Softtake VC, Aileen Lee at Cowboy Ventures, Hunter Walk at Homebrew, Samil Shah.
Chris Sacca.
There's Chris Sacca. There's lots of smaller funds that are taking early stage risk, but they can't put a lot of money at work. So we're funding short-term thinking. And that's the negative. Let me say the positive.
Yeah.
Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the decentralizing tendency. We talked about the centralizing tendency, the big companies. The blockchain, Bitcoin, and the ICO layer, which is probably on Ethereum, which is the most important new phenomenon, means large sums of money are being raised by startups, some of them bad, some of them good, much larger sums than venture capitalists would give them, for big long-term ideas, and none of that is happening in Silicon Valley. None of it. Much of it's happening in the former Soviet Union, by the way, and China, despite the government. So the world has changed. The decline in the importance of nations, the importance of both the internet and blockchain as overarching global technologies, that's the positive bit.
Ian, a quick take on the VC community. As central as always, or is Keith right? Are they becoming more marginalized?
I think it's a more varied landscape with different types of inventors. I actually would challenge the last few. And ICOs may well be funding bigger ideas, but they're also funding utter crap and no regulations. Well, but fraudulent. There's basically no regulation. I think you're seeing regulators around the globe say there are reasons we have securities laws, laws saying what can be invested in, what level of disclosure there needs to be. And I can't imagine a world in which ICOs are a good thing without that coming in. Again, I'm not a money expert, but when I hear people talk about ICOs in general, I hear, about all the schemy crap that's there, not that they're funding the next big ideas, which they may also be doing.
Keith, we got to move on to your wife now.
You're a bad man, Andrew Keane.
Sinead Tier, who's one of the co-founders of Crunchbase, which is, you know as much about tech now, the Crunchbase data resource as anyone. What are we missing here, Sinead? What haven't we talked about?
I don't know if there's anything that I would point to that we're missing. By the way, I'm not the co-founder, but I'm employee number 3 at Crunchbase, so I've been there 10 years.
That's the co-founder in my mind.
There we go.
I would call myself the co-founder if I was number 3.
So I've worked with our data at Crunchbase for a very long time, and all the trends that you talk about around AI and VR, we're definitely tracking it. You can see it in Crunchbase. I think the thing that I've been reporting about more recently over the last 3 years out of the Crunchbase data set is around female founder trends and gender equity and women in venture. And what I've seen through that reporting, when we started 3 years ago, we added gender to the data set. We could do it quite quickly. It was brought in within a couple of months. Before that, we built the data for 7 years. What we saw is in the numbers of female founders, very far from parity, but went up. For companies founded in 2009, globally, there was about 9% of companies with at least one female founder. By 2012, that is around 17%, and from 2012 to today, it's stuck to around 17%. And I think it's those numbers, more women coming into tech, more women in more diverse roles, again, very, very far from parity.
Are they doing different kinds of companies? I mean, do you buy the idea that women do tech differently?
I think that, a lot of the discussion is around how women operate differently and are somewhat more team-focused or more empathetic.
And they don't claim they're co-founders when they're not, right?
Exactly, yes. They step back. The interesting thing for me is those female founders have put pressure on the venture industry because they say when we go out and raise money, who's on the other side of the table? It's men and men and men. We did our first report 18 months ago, and we found for the top 100 firms globally, 7% of women are investing partners at those firms. We redid the report, which we launched at Grace Hopper in October. And what was interesting for me with the whole focus on gender equity, I thought the numbers would sway much more than they did. And interestingly enough, it went up 1%. So we went from 7% to 8% in 18 months. And that was very disappointing given the focus in the industry that there isn't more change and not more women on the other side of the table.
Ina?
2 points, and the first point is actually on just the existence of Crunchbase. I think that's the kind of company we haven't had enough of. As a journalist, I'm super interested in the future of journalism and media, which we haven't talked about a ton. Obviously,
or
really
creativity.
Really excited about where I work, Axios, but also about
why.
Well, I think we've hit on...
This is your plug, right?
Sure. I mean, I think Axios has hit on the idea that we're all super busy, and we want something that we can consume quickly, but that has a level of smarts to it. And it seems to have struck a nerve.
Not like USA Today. Right?
Well, USA Today had one piece of that very right, that people wanted the amount of information they could digest in a short period of time. I think we're pushing the envelope. We think you can digest more information more quickly, but in some of the same ways that they were right.
It's like an energy bar.
They had graphics. Sorry?
Like an energy bar. I mean...
A little bit. We haven't used that method. But I want to call out Crunchbase as another kind of media thing we haven't seen enough of, which is, what if reporting weren't just about writing stories? What if it started from a perspective of data? To me, there should be a Crunchbase for every industry. And I think if you look at tech journalism, it's well covered. There's a ton of things. We have a Crunchbase. I think if you look at a lot of things that are important to our society, there aren't comparable businesses. Education, covering cities, covering those kinds of things. So that's an area that I think I'd love to see.
Lady
more.
at the back. And by the way, if I haven't called on you, it doesn't mean you're not allowed to speak. It's just I know some people here. So please, we've got about 15 minutes left. So you might introduce yourself too.
My name is Pam Strayer.
And what do you do?
A lot of things in content.
Okay. So you're a creative?
Yes, I guess you would say that. Yeah, I made the first CD-ROM for Apple, the first QuickTime 1.0 video for Apple, and then kind of like on from there. I haven't heard you talk about net neutrality, and I haven't heard you talk about cybersecurity, which I would put as, front and center in the tech journalism or story of the year award. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, we only have a few hours, I guess, left to talk about net neutrality. The FCC is prepared to vote tomorrow on removing the Title II. I mean, I think what's fascinating, it's another one of these issues that I will say we're seeing a larger trend where you don't have popular support for a law that nonetheless seems to be coming into effect. There's no democratic base saying we don't want net neutrality. There are a small number of companies arguing that, and even those companies generally couch their arguments because it is so unpopular. Oh, it's not net neutrality we're opposed to. It should be done through Title B instead of Title II and Title X and whatever. I think most people agree that an open internet is really important, except for a small number of companies that would benefit from a non-open internet. I think it is super important. I think cybersecurity is one of those. Security and privacy are always important issues, and they're ones that tend to be under advocated for. I think my experience as a reporter in 20 years is we have a very short attention span for security and privacy. Some issue flares up, people get really excited about it, just long enough for Congress to schedule hearings. By the time that Congress schedules those hearings, Americans' attention is faded, nothing changes. I think one look need no further than the data breaches to look at a perfect example of terrible outcomes for security, terrible outcomes for privacy, nothing changes. We only have a few bits of genuine authentication, our biometrics, a few numbers, and when it comes to those numbers, they're all compromised. We'll see how long our biometrics stay unique to us. I suspect not long.
So not everything is data, not everything is biometrics. I mean, there's also creativity. But let's have the voice. There are a few artists here. Tom Zimbaroff is award-winning photographer who now is an entrepreneur as well. Tom, was 2017 a good year for creatives? It's been a bad century so far, I think, to be fair. Very briefly, because we've got other people. I just like a summary from you.
Well, I'm an optimistic curmudgeon, but I'm just always concerned about the inimical effects of monopoly on democracy as well as just creativity. I'm concerned about. Well, my big concern has always been that just because it's virtually free to distribute content on the internet, it doesn't follow that its commercial value should be trivialized by middlemen. And there are ways to use technology to avoid that nobody is, and I'd like to see more people doing things in that direction. By the way, this conversation is so broad and over so many different things. I wish I had 2 hours to talk.
Well, you can say. Ina, monetizing content, any developments in the last year?
A few. So
how do you make money
Patreon.
at Axios?
They actually pay me a salary.
No, but the company. Advertising?
Yeah, so it's a mix. I think good media companies these days need a mix, and so we have sponsorships for both our website and our newsletters in a way that people seem to find palatable. So just like we think people want short, digestible content, our advertisers have to do the same. We have events that are sponsored, and so we have a mix of sponsorships.
So you're making money with your online content?
The business is doing very well. It's doing better than we thought.
So you're
We're a
saying
startup.
no, really?
It's year one of a startup.
So you're not making money?
I'm not the business person. They're letting me do whatever I want. I think things are going pretty well.
What do you see, though, in the shift to paywalls? And the New York Times seems to be very successful, particularly this
So
year.
I think a few journalism entities are finding ways to make money, not enough. I think that's separate from the individual creatives, which I think is super important. I think things like Patreon that are enabling individuals are one answer, not the only answer. But I agree, as someone who creates stuff for a living, just because it's free to distribute, journalism is another thing that's very expensive to produce. Great photography, very expensive to produce. I think the other factor that's coming in is mediocre stuff has gotten cheaper to produce. Bad photography, but that's not terrible. Decent photography, let's say. Information, not necessarily accurate or great information, but something that looks like my article pretty
Tom,
cheap
if
to produce.
some of your photos are on the cover of Time. You're one of the best-known photographers of the last 30 years. If you were starting out now, could you make a living?
With my platform, I could, once again.
But if you just had a camera?
No, it's really difficult.
Very briefly, because I'm sure there are other questions. Please stick up your hand.
I'm very concerned about the fact that, well, first of all, you can't automate creativity. You can automate the tools that create creativity. I mean, you can automate, news reports about the stock exchange and whatever, and sports reports. But when you get down to it, you cannot automate those things. But I'm really concerned about how the very value of knowledge itself has been trivialized in favor of data.
Ooh. Ina, you have a high opinion of data.
No, I would
You agree?
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't have a business if it weren't for the case. There's tons of data out there, and not only is there not enough knowledge, we now have a debate in our society. We think there's two sides.
Data?
It's not just data. Knowledge is not just data. I mean, everything is a 1 or a 0. Everything is one of 26 letters. I know the alphabet. It doesn't mean I'm
Kieran, we
actually know
can't
what's
put
going
everything into your new AI machine? Yeah.
Oh. I would say that there's a finite amount of data created by any system. And we live in a world where the systems are being kind of chopped and changed by, coming back to the original question that you started on, by very gender-specific individuals who tend to be men who build the algorithms that are inherently a reflection on the masculinity or the social profile of that person. So I think we're in danger of mimicking ourselves in that sense.
Back to gender.
No, I mean, I agree. I think it's not, gender is a huge one, and there are many other ways in which our artificially intelligent future risks mimicking all the inequalities of our moderately intelligent.
Do you believe that there is technology that can solve this, that can vault over these things?
I think technology can be used to solve it. There isn't a technology that solves it. I think if there's one thing I'd boil our conversation down to, there's a series of technology issues which tend to get solved, and there's the fact that we as humans still struggle to relate to one another, which we haven't solved. And if those same human beings are programming computers, that's not going to solve it.
Kat, do you want a quick word? And Janae, and then please, we've got a couple more minutes for questions. Lynn, well, I'm just interested in Kat and Janae's response to this debate about whether data can solve these deep-rooted bias issues.
I definitely think, even if you look at linguistics and how ads are written to recruit people or in performance reviews, there's been tremendous traction in the last few years about how it's unfair to women and more in favor of a masculine tendency. So yeah, I agree with you that it has to be informed around what the problems are we're trying to solve. But yeah, I'm very hopeful.
And there are companies starting to solve those problems. So technology isn't solving it, but people using technology are. There are startups to help companies that want their help wanted ads to be gender neutral. There are startups that are helping to make tests that are less biased for applicants. So
you're in the data business, you're in the knowledge business. Are you in the data or the knowledge business at Crunchbase?
I think we're in the, the data business. We're in the data business. But, what's interesting from the reports that I've been writing is I look at the data, I dissect the data, I try and understand what the data means, and I go back. So data on its own doesn't tell you anything. I just, I guess that's as much as I have to say.
Lynn is a librarian in San Francisco Library. She runs the Children's Library. So she comes at this in a very different way. Lynn, the kids, when they come to your desk at the library, do they ask for data?
Yeah, so kids usually don't ask for data. They ask for books. They ask for analog books. Very seldom do kids actually want ebooks. So I see kids being interested in data, but not in the extent that Silicon Valley is perhaps interested in data. I had another question for Ina as well. Based on some of the things that Kat was just alluding to, and also when we alluded to the fact that there are more female founders coming into Silicon Valley, but still not in proportion to their numbers in the population. So assuming if and when we see female executives, executives of color, LGBT executives more represented among tech decision makers. How do you see that changing maybe the way society interacts with tech, and maybe what kinds of new avenues of exploration do you think that might open up for us?
Well, it's a really big question. I think certainly in the most likely and sort of sense that we can know, we won't know what ideas we're missing. We only, we'll see the ideas that we've been missing is one positive outcome that I think we'll have. I think, again, as I started, we face enormous challenges as a society, from environmental to AI, the impact on jobs, all these things. And I think we need our best minds working on it, and we don't have that. Like, we are excluding.
Well, I mean, it's we have pretty good minds here, I think.
We have a bunch of good minds, but we don't have our best minds because a bunch of groups are underrepresented. There are great minds within those underrepresented groups that are underrepresented. And not only are they great minds, but they have a unique set of experiences. I bring an experience as a transgender woman around certain issues that other people might not bring. An immigrant brings a perspective of having given up their home.
Give me an example of how that would manifest itself in terms of that perspective.
So I might have a sensitivity, like I might first show up in the fact that you don't have a unisex restroom, which could make it hard for a future employee who's transitioning. That's a real base level thing. But what about the idea that there are spaces that are more or less inviting to people, and that if you have a space that's more open, it creates more creativity? I mean, it's hard to say what a transgender person brings to company X in a short second, but it's fair to say that all these different life experiences bring with it not just pure intellectual horsepower, but also things that you're more sensitive to. And I think that's true of every group that's underrepresented. I think actually the fact that Silicon Valley has a lot of people who are socially awkward or immigrants, like some of those things we're overrepresented and we get the benefit of that.
In Silicon Valley.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say we are over-indexing for that.
Is anyone socially awkward here?
And I think we solve some small set of problems better for that. But again, I think if everyone were represented, we'd have a greater diversity of ideas. And all the math on this, all the studies prove this out, that more diverse teams produce better results. And that wouldn't be the case if what I'm saying wasn't true.
Final questions? Anyone not spoken like to ask Ines or make a comment? Well, I think we're going to... Oh, one gentleman here. Final here.
Thank you. Very rapidly, I'm Zoltán Istenes from Budapest,
Hungary.
I was
going to, another view from the outside. You're from Hungary.
Yes, I'm from the Eötvös Loránd University. I'm from EIT Digital, and we were speaking about technology, industry, innovation. Where is the role of education and universities in this whole ecosystem? What we can do, what should we do, and how can we connect?
Let me just ask you, you're from Hungary, you're visiting. Are you intrigued, surprised, or just take it for granted that we spent practically the whole evening talking about women and tech? Is this just an American thing?
No, of course, it's an important issue.
You buy it? It's the big issue, do you think?
It's a big issue, so I very like this whole conversation. I think the topic were very, very, very interesting, so I really enjoyed them. But and it's very different, of course, in Hungary. Right. I don't have a complete view. We are here since a couple of days only, but we just scratching the surface. But still very interesting, very different, sometimes similar.
So sorry, I interrupted you. What was your question?
University education. So
university.
What is the place of education and universities, or this whole ecosystem? What we can do, what we should do as a university?
Final question.
It's hugely important. We talk a lot about whether jobs are coming or going away because of artificial intelligence. I think there is no doubt that jobs are going to change. Robots will be able to do manual tasks. Automation will take away a lot. There are a lot of good jobs that exist today that won't exist 20 years from now. It is hard for me to imagine a future in which the jobs that we create won't demand a good education. I think as we raise the bar for what a computer can do, I can't imagine a world that won't require better education. And the U.S. is not leading here. We're not winning this. There's no way to look at the facts and say we're doing a good job here.
Well, I think this has been an amazing conversation for one particular reason, that we didn't mention the T word. So I'm going to hand over to another T, Taryn, who's going to close. But Ina, wonderful job. Thank you so much.
First, let's have a round of applause for Ina and Andrew.